Welcome back to the Job Hunter podcast, the only show on the internet that takes the stress and hassle out of working out what to do next. This week we'll be having a very solid conversation which I hope won't sag under the weight of expectation of you listeners. Not sure what I'm getting at? Well, sit back, relax, and let's get on with this week's episode. Hello, it's your favourite career-based audio outlet, the Job Hunter podcast. On this week's show, it's my pleasure to welcome Matt Widdowson. Matt works as an architect, the extremely talented bunch behind some of the most magnificent man-made structures on the planet, from skyscrapers to bridges to train stations and everything in between. So Matt, that is my very brief understanding of what an architect does, but is that right at all? What sort of stuff does an architect actually do day to day?
You have hit the nail on the head there. They do everything in between, all of that. But for the real side of architecture, or at least if you're not one of these huge firms you see on the likes of Instagram and stuff, it's probably more likely houses, apartments, shop fittings, things like that, schools, things like that is my experience. And we can get into that later on. But yeah, you've got it right there. It's everything from shop fitting all the way up to whole cities, master planning, not just individual buildings. You know, architects spend a lot of time designing whole swathes of cities as well. So yeah, it's a wide spectrum.
So what would you say is like your bread and butter then? You know, I said it's a spectrum, but what are you typically doing on a day-to-day basis? What kind of stuff are you working on at the moment that you can talk about?
So I was thinking about before coming into this interview, thinking about these kind of questions and looking at my kind of what I'd say my kind of bread and butter is, or my main strength. But I've worked at now, so I started at a new architecture firm just at the start of February. So I'm halfway through my third week there now. But I've worked as an architect, well, varying stages of architecture, because I have actually only just become what is technically a qualified architect. And again, I can get into the ins and outs of that. But I've worked at 4 practices, and across those 4 practices, I've covered now, I think, apart from the likes of skyscrapers, because obviously in the UK, unless you're working down in London or something, the chance of doing skyscrapers is very slim just because there isn't any. I've pretty much covered all areas, if you like. At my first practice in Manchester back in 2012, I spent a lot of time working on university buildings up in Lancaster. They did a master plan for Lancaster University, and we did the science building, which won a couple of awards, actually. And then after I went back to uni, did my master's, I came out and I started for a firm in Liverpool, which I did a lot of shop fitting stuff. They worked with Liverpool One, Grosvenor, who own Liverpool One, which is a large section of a retail park in the city. So I did a lot of retail and commercial. And then when I was there, and I've been there a while, I got my own jobs, which were doing school extensions. So I was doing a lot of small scale for the council, but doing them on my own, which was good experience. But 1 to 2 room extensions, so very small scale stuff. And then when I left there in 2018, I went to another firm and I did residential, which I'd never done before. So I did individual one-off houses in Cheshire and apartment blocks in the city of Chester. And then I've left there. And now at my new firm, I'm doing solely hospitals, which again, I'd never ever done healthcare before. So between the 4 places, I've kind of covered, I've done commercial and retail, housing, and now healthcare. So I've kind of covered nearly all the bases.
So how does that vary between those different sectors? Obviously, the requirements for a hospital are going to be completely different for, say, like a leisure centre or someone's house.
It is. That's what makes architecture quite a difficult. Well, it can be, obviously, as your years go by and you gain this experience. Obviously, you become more knowledgeable in it all. But that is one of the difficulties to architecture, I'd say, is that I've come into this job this month with years of experience behind me, but I kind of feel like I'm brand new to the job again, or to doing this job for the first time, because obviously a lot of it's the same, your knowledge of how buildings are constructed and structures and details are the same, but things to do with regulations, building regulations are similar, but then hospitals have a whole swathe of different government regulations on how big rooms need to be, security for them, protection for users, stuff like that, which I'd never seen before. So it is difficult that you have to then jump in and I've spent a couple of, the last 2 weeks between doing work kind of reading up on their different regulations and stuff to try and get up to speed with hospital layout. But a lot of it is similar in other aspects. Like I'm working with a construction company called Kia doing these hospitals, who is the same company I worked on doing the schools. So, there is crossover, but there is between those different sectors, you have to not only learn a new design technique, because obviously the way in which you design a bespoke shop in London is going to be different to how you design a mental ward in a hospital. So it's a big learning curve when you go from one to the other, definitely.
And what do you think is like the best way of kind of really gaining that knowledge? Do you think it's learning from other people? Do you think it's being hands-on? Do you think it's reading about it? It must be quite daunting going into a new job when you've got all those previous skills, but also feeling like you've got to start afresh a little bit.
Yeah, it is daunting. It's very daunting. So my Velcro seat lifting up there. It is daunting. I felt when I went on the first day and I was getting kind of briefed on all these different jobs I was going to be on, I was a bit like, especially because it was my first time as an architect. I was like, this is going to be intense. But the last couple of weeks, reading a lot, like I said, reading those documents and going through the different regulations has helped. But just working with the other architect on the job and sitting in on the meetings and stuff, like you would with any kind of job, I think when you first start, just kind of getting thrown at the deep end can seem a bit intense, but I think in the long run, it does help just to get thrown in and just learn on the job, as they say.
So if we were going to wind back the clock a few years, let's go back to before you'd even thought about this as a career. What made you want to become an architect, or at least start this journey into becoming an architect? When you were at school, kind of thing.
Yeah. So in school, back in sixth form time, which before then, I'm not embarrassed to say, because I think this is true of a lot of people, but some people probably wouldn't admit it. I didn't have a clue what I wanted to do up till you're doing your GCSEs, and already by that stage you've made a selection of different subjects you want to do, and by doing that you've already narrowed down your windows of opportunity in the future by dropping certain subjects, which looking back now, you're only 15, 16 at the time, it's quite daunting when you think about it. But back then I just dropped topics that I just didn't like. I hadn't really thought further than what I want to be in the future, because I being honest, I didn't really know. But I was strong in my kind of design and designing, and also kind of hands-on designing, so not just like art and things, but DT and stuff. So or design it was graphic design technology, that was it at A level. So for A levels I didn't actually pick art, because I already had started to think that whilst I wanted to do something design based, art itself, and not to disrespect art in any way, but it's not quite as much as a vocation as some other kind of design based courses out there. So I started to look into what I could do with. I ended up doing geography and graphic design in English, and I actually really like geography, which comes into play massively with architecture, especially when you're doing town planning and master planning. So I really like geography. I really like graphic design. And when it came time to start looking at university courses, I had never even considered architecture, but it kind of seemed to me at the time to merge those two subjects together, and it had a vocation at the end of it. You go in to do architecture and you come out as an architect, rather than doing something a bit more vague, such as graphic design or something, or just design or DT, and then coming out and not being too clued up as to where to go with it. So I kind of fell into it in that mindset, but it definitely wasn't something I'd thought about, from a small child, should we say.
Looking up at the skyscrapers above you, kind of thing.
Exactly, yeah.
I think that's a really good point, though, in the sense you're saying that we're kind of forced at a very young age to narrow down our options very quickly, but at the same time, you can kind of pivot and do what you want at any point, can't you? Really, and I think we cut from very much the same cloth in terms of that aspect. I had no clue what I wanted to do, and going into a technical subject as well, doing engineering is very similar. But what would you say are kind of the key attributes or the key skills that you learned while you're at university, and what do you think makes a good architect?
That's a good question, because I think architecture, I think I should break this question down into how the stages of studying architecture at university, because there's a lot to it, because for that reason that you learn different attributes as you go along. So to become an architect, a chartered architect, which not to put anyone off, I became a chartered architect in October of 2020, and I went to start university in September of 2009. So it's an 11-year journey. Doesn't have to be. You can do it quicker once you leave your masters, but the reality of it, once you're in the workplace, it's not always as simple as that. But So yeah, you have to you join university as you would to do what is a bachelor in architecture for a 3-year course. And in your first 3 years, it's all about just starting to see design. And it's amazing that you go into university, I think like all quite, you leave sixth form and you think you're kind of king of the roost, and then you get to university and you suddenly realize quite quickly, when you're out in the real world, that you're quite naive to not only living, life, living by yourself and all that kind of the new aspects of university, but also the difference between what you learn in school and what you learn in university is such a massive step. But for your first 3 years, kind of to paraphrase it, because obviously there's a lot to cover, but you learn the basics of designing. So you do start to get an eye for walking into a building, and just start to see what works, how it's all to do with ratios of how humans interact with a space and sizes of things, and how your first 3 years is very artistic in terms of there's never any project you do, there's never a real budget. You're never said you need to design a building and it's got you've got 6 months and you've got £500,000. It's just we were designing these grand art galleries and underground like these huge kind of, also as well, they always say you need to design for 50 years in the future, because the idea of future proofing buildings. But that just meant a lot of times students were designing these kind of post-apocalyptic underground dwellings, because in 50 years time the whole world, the surface of the earth is kind of unlivable. But again, and they let you do that. So with your bachelor's, they do let you run away with your imagination and just kind of get your design juices flowing, if you like. So that's when you leave after your bachelor's and you do your part 1 placement then. So you go into the real world, and that is a big shock. That's the real kick, because you go from having your architecture tutors, trying to boost you and push you to come up with these kind of radical designs, to suddenly then you're designing toilets in a train station in Frodsham. So it's a real sudden, and that's the real first taste of, the reality of architecture, because so then you go into your first, your part 1 placement, where you're what is called a part 1 assistant, an architectural assistant, part 1, because you have these different parts to it. And you do that for 12 months. And that's when I was working in Manchester, and I was working on this university, the science building at Lancaster University. And I mean, when I say I was working on it, I was doing small things like there was about 200 windows on it, and each window had to be designed individually with these louvers and grills. And I just spent basically 12 months drawing windows. But I got involved in some other exciting things. I don't know if you've ever seen King's Cross Station in London, the big sweeping canopy. That was John McCaslin, who I worked for in Manchester. So that was, we were involved with that at the time. Not really, obviously not designing any of it, but it was cool to be a part of that whilst that was going on, because that won some REBA prizes. And we worked on a Vancouver, British Columbia Museum in Canada, which was a cool job. We never got to go across there, sadly, but worked on that, doing a redesign and an extension for their museum, which was quite cool. And then you go back to university and you do your master's then, and that's when you've had a taste of the real world. And in your master's, then they kind of double down on that, and you start to learn more about planning, law. Not much though, but a little bit of that. And you still, again, in my master's, I designed this huge train station for Liverpool, which would never be needed. It's just absolutely gargantuan train station. But it was, I'd always wanted to design something like that. I remember being in Berlin at the big Bahnhof station in Berlin, and thinking this would be a cool thing to do for my for my master's degree. And then you leave again, and you're a part 2 assistant then, so you're back in the real world, and that's it. Then you don't go back to university formally, but then once you've done your master's, you have to do a part 3 then, which is you have to gain a year's experience, at least 2 years experience, and then you have to have basically done a project from start to finish on your own, or at least you leading it, which was the school extensions I was doing. And then you sit your part 3, which involves all sorts, essays, 2 days of exams, interviews. And once you pass all that, you finally can call yourself a chartered architect. So rambling a bit there, but you get the idea. It's a long process. So throughout those different stages, you learn the different aspects to try and even now, people often say architects don't know everything until they're retired, because there's just so much to it all that it's every day's a school day in work.
I mean, to make a terrible analogy, it sounds like your career path is very much like building a building, isn't it? You start with the foundations and you work your way to the top, don't you?
You never quite get it finished. It feels like, the roof's never on.
Like a Greek house. I think that's really interesting, because I think a lot of people might be a bit naive in terms of, oh, I just go to uni and I pop out at the end of it with a degree and that's me done. But this continuous professional development seems like it's been taken to the max with architecture. How do you get that resilience? But how do you have the will to go back to university after spending a whole year making windows?
Yeah, it is a difficult one. Especially like you said, the resilience. I mean, to answer your last question first, there, going back to university was actually a relief, because after a year of doing that, I was ready to get back into university and design some whimsical space station again or something, rather than working on windows or toilets. So, there was that aspect. I was actually looking forward to getting back into uni after the first year. But I must admit, I think anybody would be lying to you if they didn't say during a process that takes 11 years. I mean, it doesn't take 11 years. You can, if you would buy the book and did it as quick as possible, once you came out with your masters, if you got that extra 2 years experience and did your project in that time, you could get it done pretty quick. So you could come out with your masters after 7 or 8 years. But I took quite a while to get it done, because I was just working on so many other projects that the last thing I want to do after coming home from work is then just write about it if I was doing the dissertation or get prepared for the exam. So, that kind of answers your question about resilience. Just actually finally getting yourself ready to take that step and do it, because it's very expensive to do your part 3. I was lucky that my workplace paid for it, and if you don't pass first time, it's at another large sum of money to go, to do it again and again. So it's not the kind of thing you want to think, oh, I'll throw my hat in and see how I do. You want to do it when you're ready. So, but I'd be lying if I said in that 11 years I've not really wanted to throw the towel in. A couple of times you just think, is this for me? Working on, because you have good days and bad days with architecture. You'll have days where you've cracked something, you've designed something, or you've achieved something, or something's won an award or got planning permission, and you're on top of the world. And then you have days where sites calling you all day because they found a pipe under the ground that they didn't expect to be there, and it's not on their surveys, and then you need to contact the guys doing the surveys and find out about, and it's you get days of just, you really come away thinking, I don't know why I do this, because another misnomer with architecture is, for the amount of work you do, you come out of university after 7 years or whatever, and your pay isn't as competitive as you would imagine after that amount of time at university, not at first at least. So that also kind of doubles down on sometimes you feel like it's not quite worth it. But you do have to have I think you have to have kind of just be quite resilient and quite tough skinned, I think, to get even this far with architecture. I do think, yeah.
So let's just take it a bit away from being serious. I think we've made a good start. If you had to pick your favorite building in the whole world ever, even ones that have no longer with us, if they've been demolished, what would it be?
One building.
One building, yeah.
This is going to sound quite, it's the kind of thing people, I think you get all these Instagram architects, but I've been and seen it, and it annoyed me that I liked it so much, because it was almost cliche. But there's a building in New York called the Oculus, which is it's in quite a lot of films now. It almost looks, it's at Ground Zero. It's the new, well, it's a mixture of things. It's a shopping center, but you come up from the underground station at Ground Zero and into this building, and it looks like the spine of like a stegosaurus, if you like. It's this kind of humpback shape, but it's like the rib cage of like a massive whale. But it's called Oculus, the Oculus. And the architect who did it escapes me now. It's a very famous architect. Is it Herzog? It might be Herzog, but yeah, it's this amazing white building that, if you haven't seen, it's in a lot of films. It was in the latest John Wick film, actually. They were having like a shootout in there. But yeah, that's an amazing building that, it was impressive for myself, because we were getting the train when we were in New York. We were getting the underground from Times Square to Ground Zero, and it hadn't occurred to me that we were going to arrive at that station. So you get off the train in the underground and you ride the escalator up, and then all of a sudden it was this kind of reveal. I was like, oh, we're in the Oculus building.
And I bet everyone else didn't care at all, and you were just there like a little fanboy.
Everyone else was there, yeah, exactly. Heads down, just carrying on. And I was like, so I took a lot of photographs then, and then we went up the new World Trade Center, which again, it's a pretty simple looking building. It's essentially a glass rectangle, but when you're actually at the top there, it's an amazing building. But yeah, if I had to nail it down, I'd say that. I think, yeah, the Oculus.
So in that regard, coming back to 9/11 and One World Trade Center, do you think like the provenance and like the history of a building can play more into its kind of people's affections in that sense. The Eiffel Tower is a very iconic structure. But do you think if it wasn't known for kind of where it was, if it was anywhere else in the world and not in Paris, do you think people would hold it in such high regard? Do you think there is a link between kind of human affection and whatever to how we look at buildings?
Oh, certainly. That's something they get you in university. Really, is a relationship between people and buildings, and not just physically and dimensionally, but also emotionally. Big time. There's so many buildings. I think a classic one is something like Big Ben. Big Ben could, if that was just the bell tower of the cathedral in Sheffield city centre, it's a nice, cool building. But it wouldn't be Big Ben. It's the clock tower in London that everyone loves to go and see. It's because that's the kind of postcard portrait of London. And again with New York, if you've when you go to things like the Empire State Building and stuff, nowadays it's always got that provenance, and it's amazing to see when you first lay your eyes on it. But because it was the world's tallest building at the time, and it was iconic in the New York skyline, but it's now kind of just dwarfed by so many other buildings that you wouldn't really take a second glance if it wasn't already so infamous and so famous. So yeah, I think there's a real relationship and tie between people's emotions through history and buildings, and not even that people sometimes realize that you don't have to be interested in buildings to have this emotional connection to you show just a crowd of random people certain skylines, and they'll know them because they've grown up seeing it on certain buildings on TV. Or so yeah, I definitely think there's a strong connection between everybody and iconic buildings.
Do you need to be good at drawing to be an architect? Because I'm rubbish. I did an engineering degree and I managed to fluke all of my design creative parts of my degree because A, I had really good people in my group project that would do it all for me, and B, it wasn't a prerequisite to be good at drawing. So all of my drawing was rubbish, but it was good enough. Is that something that is super important? Do you have to be able to draw nowadays, or can you get away with being good with the computers instead, kind of thing?
I can tell you, because I am not a good drawer, that drawing is it does help, because especially it seems to help actually the higher up you get, because when you become a director, it seems that you don't actually spend any time doing the detailed drawings. You might sketch a design together and show somebody and say, put this together. So the ability to sketch quickly, or sketch for a client in a meeting with a client, they might be talking and you might be quickly sketching like a kind of fag packet, little tiny drawing to show them. So that ability helps, but in the real world, day to day in the office, it really doesn't matter. And I can attest to that, because in my bachelor's, so in our first year, they really tried to push the whole hand drawn thing. We had to buy big easels and drawing boards and drawing sets and stuff. And I passed first year with 45%. You had to get 40%, or 40% was if you got lower than 40, you failed the year. And I got 45% in my first year because we did everything by hand. And I can sketch probably better than average, but I'm not a good drawer by any stretch of the imagination. And then in second year, it was just kind of, they opened the doors then and said, you can use whatever techniques you like. And that was it. Then I was using things back then like SketchUp, ArchiCAD, AutoCAD, drawing tools online. And then I passed my second year with the highest grade in the year. I got like 88 something percent in my second year, because a lot of people stayed with the people who were strong with the drawing stayed with that because that was their strength, and resisted getting onto the computers. But in the real world, eventually in the real workplace, you 100% of what you do is on a computer. You're not going to be doing technical drawings by hand. So it's funny that it was almost a whole flip reverse then. By second year, the people who'd jumped onto the computers early did the best, and the people who'd really done well in first year with the hand-drawn stuff, who tried to hang on to that, kind of didn't do as well in second year. And it took a while, by the end of third year, they were kind of back there again, but it took a while to catch up again. So yeah, the two, and I'll add to that, I think maths is another one that I wasn't strong at maths. I got a B at GCSE, I think, and I didn't go any further with it than that. I was in like kind of bottom sets for maths. It was never a strong point of mine. So maths and hand drawing, which is the kind of things people think is architecture. And you do a lot of maths. And like today, I've just spent all day having to calculate window dimensions for all these different elevations for a building. But it's nothing that you can't just pull up on your calculator and do. You don't need to be good at maths. So That's another common misperception, I think, as well.
I think unis love doing that though, where they like love to teach you things wrong first, and then they like go, "Aha, we taught you it wrong. I'm gonna have to tell you it right now." And then like, oh, it's just like a cruel joke. I think maths is another great one because my experience of maths at university was going from being absolutely terrible at A level, to then going through the point of doing quantum mechanics in my final year, and now all I'm doing is plugging numbers into Excel. So I think don't like be put off if you're not great at maths. You just have to kind of be good enough, because once you get into the real workplace, it's just not how it works, and no one's going to test you ever again on your maths because everyone just uses Google anyway, don't they?
Exactly. Yeah.
So if we had to go through, like, if we just were thinking about, right, we've got a plot of land and we want to put some houses on it, what is the process briefly?
Yeah.
from taking a bare patch of land to having a finished development, from an architectural side?
So again, briefly, because I could dive into this all day long, but the starting point there depends on who you are in this story. If you're the owner of the land, or the developer, there's different stages to how you go about it. But if you'd bought the land, so now you owned it, potentially you might have already, before you bought it, the clever thing to have done would have had a what's called a pre-planning meeting. So I don't think anybody would go into buying land without finding out if they could actually build something on it first, because otherwise it would be a big waste. And that's often what happens to raise the value of land. That we've worked a lot of times where a client will buy land, they'll get planning permission. They'll get us to design. Maybe if it's only a small plot of land, let's say you might fit 4 houses on, get planning permission for it, and then they'll sell it. They won't actually build it. They'll just sell it, because now that land is worth maybe 2, 3, 4 times as much money, because it now has planning permission, and somebody else can buy it, and it's more valuable because they know they can go away and they can build on it. But that's kind of deviating from your question a bit. So let's say we did know it was allowed to have a building on, or have some kind of development on. Yeah, you would then hire an architect, and we would then, sit down and come up with the client, what do you want to fit on here? If it was just a client who's wanting to flip it, I want to build as many houses as I can legal, for the legal sizes, and then sell it. We'd spend a couple of weeks drawing it up, designing it. Okay, let's say we can fit 5 3-bedroom houses on here with, the legal requirements for distance between houses and distance, from window to window and drives and all that. 5 houses. We would then put a planning application in. So you have to apply. You put an application into the council, which the client would pay for. And then there's about an 8-week, it's meant to be on paper, an 8-week process to get planning applications signed off. I've had it take anything from 8 weeks to 7 months. It's going to take 8 weeks, and it can take months and months and months for the council to actually fulfill their duty to get planning application. So once you've got planning, then you would then go on to that's what's called REBA stage 2, because you have these REBA stages that go from stage 1 to stage 7. Stage 3 is then you've got planning, you're then starting to develop it more. So you're starting to, because for planning, it doesn't have to be, it can be very basic. Planners just want to know, what's it going to look like? How big is it going to be? Is it going to be nice? They're not bothered what the inside looks like. They just care about externals and size and space. So then you're designing the inside, the layouts. You might get an M&E engineer on board to come in and look at the mechanical, electrical, where your plug sockets are going to be, where your piping is going to be. You'll have structural engineers who might need to do ground surveys to check that you're not going to dig up piping and stuff under the ground. But all that would have been done. A lot of that would have been done in your planning, checking that the ground is actually good for building buildings. And then you get to stage 4, which is further development. Again, now you're doing things like 1 to 5 details. You're looking at the real close stuff, like how the roof joins, how the eaves work and how the brick detailing works, how the below DPC, which is kind of your foundations work. And then you're on site. Then stage 5 is you're on site, and it starts to get built. And hopefully, if you've got a good a good construction team, or if it's a bigger scheme, you've got a good contractor. It could take you, for 5 houses, I'd say. If it was in this situation, maybe 4 months, 5 months to build 5 houses if you had a big enough team doing it all simultaneously. And then you have to get it signed off. And then the architect, from our perspective, is liable then, depends on the contract type, but normally is liable for about 4 or 5 years afterwards. So if the roof fell off within 2 years, not just the architect, they might try and come to us, but then we'd say, well, actually, we didn't design the roof. The structural engineer designed the roof. So we just pass on the, there's a whole world of issues there that kind of lead on from legal issues and who's to blame. But they're the kind of very, very basic stages of going from a field to a housing estate.
So it sounds to me, as well as being an architect, you've got to be, a project manager. You've got to be, a bit of a scrum master. You've got to organize all these people. Was that something you kind of expected going into it? That it was so much more than just, doing design and doing drawings?
No, and that's my biggest point. I'm surprised I haven't actually made that so far in this kind of chat. Is that's probably the biggest shock is, especially when you get to my stage where you're an actual architect. I'd say it's well, not apart from this new role where because I'm new, I'm kind of doing a bit of the kind of the basic task still. But if you're running a job as the architect, I'd say it's about 80% dealing with the planners, dealing with meetings, interviews, emails, what's called DTMs, which are design team meetings, which can take place multiple times a week. Corresponding with the planners, corresponding with the construction team, corresponding with all these different parties. And then the other, what did I say there? 70%. The other 30% might be actually, doing drawings or design. Very small amount is actually designing stuff. A lot of it is, like you said, project management. And that just depends. Again, very simply, with architects, you kind of get two types of contract. You get a traditional contract, which is where the architect is in charge. You'll have the client, the person, yourself who wants a house built, and then you've employed me, the architect, and then I employ everybody else as a subcontractor under me. That's a traditional contract where I am in charge. I'm the project manager. I'm making sure everything happens as it should be. But the more commonplace these days, especially working with cheaper buildings, is what's called a design and build contract, where we might work for the client to start with when we're first working up a design for planning. But then once it actually gets planning, you might get novated across to a construction team then, or a contractor like Kia. And then so we're no longer working for the client. We now just do the role of architect. We don't have to be project manager or project lead. We're just doing the design role, and the contractor, he takes all that responsibility. And we still have to communicate with everyone with the other subcontractors. We may still have some subcontractors. We might have, the building control or like fire control. We might subcontract them ourselves. So yeah, it does depend on the contract type. More architecture, it's a big kind of point of contention, actually, that over the last 30 years or so, the role of the architect has become quite watered down, which has then affected things like the architect's fee. And then, of course, because of that, the architect's salary, how much we get paid, because the kind of how much fee we're putting in has seemed to get less and less as the role that we take on gets watered down, because now there's just there's just jobs popping up out of nowhere that just take a little chunk away every now and again from the architect's position.
Definitely. If we could, again, segue away from the serious topics, I like to do a little section in the middle of these podcasts called Tim's Free Tips. I'm surprised I haven't created a terrible jingle to go with the terrible name. And in essence, what it is I ask my esteemed guests, the experts in their field, to give some advice, three bits of advice on a particular topic, an everyday topic that our listeners might be going through. So as I said, previous episodes, we've had how to escape from quicksand, how to win any argument, how to be good at speaking, public speaking, stuff like that. So for you, as you are an architect, I thought, could you give us 3 tips that would help someone who might be planning or thinking about doing like a back garden pub build or something like that? What 3 bits of advice would you give them?
I was having a little think about this earlier on. I think one you have to be careful with is planning, because you don't technically, like something like that, like a garden pub, like a summer house essentially, or you don't on paper need planning. But if you block a neighbor's right to light, if you're overcasting their back garden with a load of shadow now with this building, or if it's over a certain size, you are going to need a planning application. Or if it's a health risk, if you're just throwing this together out of a load of timber and then throw some heaters in there, you could be liable. So the first thing is, depending on how ambitious it's going to be, you do need to, 9 times out of 10, you're not going to need planning because you're building some kind of garage size timber shed. But again, if it's bigger than half your garden, if it's more than half of your garden, you will need planning. And if it's over 3 meters, or if it's blocking people's light. So just make sure you're doing it legally. Otherwise, having to tear it all down halfway through your first pint in your garden pub is not going to be the most enjoyable thing. Second is is, I was saying, sturdy foundations, quite, in the metaphorical and literal sense, that you need to make sure you are doing this on good ground, because whilst something like that may not necessarily need foundations, if it's just going to be a timber deck flooring, if the ground underneath is not solid, or it's not drained properly, and after 2 years of being there, you've got water residue building up underneath, and you're suddenly starting to sink like the Titanic in there, that's not going to be the best. And the opposite to that, the complete opposite to water underneath the building, is water on top of it. I've seen this actually quite recently this summer. I've seen this in real life. That somebody built I think it was like a garden pub, and they just put a flat roof on it. And you can have flat roofs, but a flat roof in reality is always at least 1% inclined. Otherwise, rainwater's just going to build on it. A flat roof that was just timber, and I think they'd put up like a single ply tar cover on it, like painted it on, and water just built up like a puddle. And then before they knew it, it got through. So yeah, an angled roof is always better. Not too angled, because again, if you put more than like a 35-degree pitch on beyond a certain height, again, you will need planning. But just make sure your roof isn't going to turn into a swimming pool on top, unless you've kind of designed that in.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And I'll definitely take that on board when I'm rich enough to own a nice big garden and can afford to have my own pub in the back, because I imagine that's all those people that are doing that right now are definitely winning in life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
If I could ask you another very cheeky question.
Yeah.
My favourite programme related to buildings is, of course, Grand Designs with Kevin MacLeod. But a question I want to ask you, do all architects end up having scandalous affairs with the client's wives? Because it always seems like Kevin MacLeod ends up knocking up the client's wife, and when he goes back in 9 months' time to go and do the revisit, there's always a little sprog running around. So my question is that something that actually happens, or is this all in the fictitious world of Grand Designs?
If it is, I'm missing out, because I've worked with some lovely clients as well, and it's not been something that we've I've experienced. But
let's hope your partner isn't listening.
Yeah, and on Grand Designs, if you're ever going into architecture thinking Grand Designs is the day-to-day, I can guarantee it's not. In fact, I think, like, with most things, I used to enjoy Grand Designs, but now I just can't stand watching it, because you do one thing all day long, and even though it's not the same, the last thing I want to do is listen to somebody how they're designing an biodiverse house in the Cotswolds. So yeah,
I think it's also like a great example of like where having a budget and a proper planning, it just doesn't work sometimes in some of these builds, because they always end up going ridiculously over budget and over time frame, don't they? Which is not the real world, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, anytime I do watch that, I know straight away they say, we're building this 16-bedroom house out of all these renewable biodiverse materials. It's going to heat itself on biofuel, and our budget is 14 grand. You're like, that's not going to happen.
And we're still living in our caravan 8 years later because we've not finished it.
Exactly, yeah.
So what do you think are the two bits that you absolutely love and absolutely hate about your job? I know these are tough questions, the real questions now.
Two bits I love to start with. I'll go for the good ones first. I love, in a practical sense, more than just saying, I love the emotion of when you get a good building completed. I love doing some of the cutting edge technology I've got to work with architecture over the last couple of years. Not recently, my last two places, but when I was working in the centre of Liverpool, it was myself who championed it, because I'd seen somebody else doing it. But I think I championed it essentially because I was the youngest person there, and I knew what VR was basically. So we in every firm I've worked at, part of architecture is you're always building 3D models, and from those models you can do CGIs, you can do nice visual images to show a client. But I've always thought, well, we've already made these models, and now VR was, the last 4 or 5 years, VR's, with things like the HTC Vive and the Oculus, it's become a lot more mainstream, hasn't it? And I saw a company doing it, and I actually approached my bosses, who were very, very open to that stuff. They were really good with things like that. And I said, I think we can buy VR, and we already make the models. We can very easily implement this into our design stream and make another revenue stream off it. And we did that. We could charge. It was an extra. We could say to the client, well, we can do these CGIs for you for X amount, but if you want to be able to put a headset on and walk around your building, because you got to appreciate that a lot of people can't look at a drawing or a plan or a section or an elevation and see it in 3D in their mind. So being able to drop a headset on somebody and say, right, you stood in your lobby of your new 6-story office block, it instantly sells it to them. And it's a good design tool as well, not just to show them the finished product, but along the way, you can get a sense of scale, you can get a sense of light, and So for me, kind of getting to explore some of the kind of the newer technologies and ways of understanding and developing design has been amazing. I've really enjoyed doing that, and not just VR, things like animated fly-throughs, doing CGI images. The way they've developed in the last few years has been a real kind of, it's jumped leaps and bounds. And then on the other side of the spectrum, things I don't enjoy, it's just some of the kind of, all the admin goes without saying. Things like dealing with emails all day long, dealing with the council, having the council asking you, oh, we need a bat survey. We need you to employ somebody to come down and check there's no bats in this building, because if there is, you can't knock it down. Or we need you to do a nesting bird survey, because if the birds are going to be nesting in this tree during nesting season, then you can't cut it down. Just the kind of red tape, jumping through red tape when it comes to architecture. There's a lot of it, especially if you're working with things like buildings that are listed or buildings that are in a UNESCO heritage area, which a lot of Liverpool is. There's a lot of red tape. So I'd say they're probably the two spectrums of either end of the spectrum of architecture.
But at the moment, the pros outweigh the cons.
Just.
So what would you say has been your most memorable project so far? You mentioned you've only just kind of finally qualified as an architect, but you must have done a fair few different buildings on your 11-year journey to becoming an architect completely. Is there anything that particularly stands out, or any particular aspect of a project that stands out?
There is, but sadly they're not. And this is the way with architecture as well. A lot of stuff just doesn't get built, and I don't just mean from the earlier stages. You might do an application and then the planners don't like it. We have done things where there will be a file somewhere with 1,000 drawings in, ready. If they turn around and said we're going to build it, we can say, well, there you go, you can go and build it tomorrow. We took it right the way to stage 4 of drawing. Right the way down to the details of the piping and the toilets. It's right the way there, and then because of budget or the client, whatever reasons, they just think we can't actually afford to build this now, but we'll come back to it maybe in 10 years' time. And that's a sad thing to see, because you've worked on things that you've really enjoyed. And so I'd say probably the one I've enjoyed the most is one of those cases. It hasn't been built, but in the Albert Dock of Liverpool, which is a world famous area, it's an iconic area. It's in a UNESCO World Heritage Site. We won a competition. We entered. And that's the thing with architecture. You enter a lot of competitions. You do a lot of work which is kind of at risk, because you might spend hundreds of hours working on it for a competition and then not win the competition, and then you don't, it goes nowhere. It's just wasted time, essentially. But we won a competition to design 5 floating restaurants in the Albert Dock. And from my understanding, that is still going to go ahead. The Albert Dock is owned by a conglomerate called Planet. And from my understanding, they're still going ahead with that at some point. It's probably been put on the back burner while things like COVID are still going on. But that was an amazing thing to work on, to get that through planning. That's still actually in my kind of job portfolio when I apply for jobs now. Is we designed these amazing restaurants that were all designed around the Dazzle ships back in the day, when they used to paint the ships with those mad patterns to try and make it more difficult to see which direction they were heading in when it came to German U-boats. We did it like that. So all these quite crazy angular shapes, restaurants that were going to float on the water. So you'd be walking around kind of like on decks, like you do if you were kind of getting onto a barge or getting onto a boat on the dock, and have these really beautiful restaurants that were in the water, kind of reflecting off all the lights and stuff. That would, and that's when I'd just come out of university as well. So it was in 2016, and it was a really exciting project to be a part of. And I'm hoping they still get built, so one day I can walk down there and be like, I had a big part of that.
So when you've had a few pints and you get dazzled by your camouflage and accidentally fall in the Albert Dock.
Yeah, that was, you made that joke. That was a genuine concern. I mean, it's already so many bars and clubs down there, in an area that's got Victorian age rail fences that don't probably pass health and safety these days. But it was a genuine concern, that.
How do you think buildings and kind of building design is going to change in the future? Obviously, the way we make buildings now compared to a century ago when we designed and built like the Empire State Building, they're unrecognizable. How do you see that changing in the next 100 years?
I think the changes, those changes have already started to come into place. I'm going to make a comparison to like cars that, now that we're all still driving around with petrol and diesel cars, but we all know what the future is. It is out there on the road. It's electric cars, isn't it? It's cars that might be more solar dependent, or even cars based on other things like salt water and all this stuff. That the technology is there. It's not there on the grand scheme of things. And that's the same with architecture. For a long time in the future, we're still going to get your normal brick and mortar type houses, but there is some great projects out there already, and there's a lot of implementation of systems to make it so the future is a lot more healthy to the environment. There's a system called BREEAM, which is BREEAM, and I will not tell you what that stands for because I cannot remember. But BREEAM is a rating system that already now you have like BREEAM good, BREEAM very good, and BREEAM excellent, and that's based on not just the building itself saying it's got all these solar panels on the roof that are so it can generate 90% of its own hot water, or it can generate 90% of its own electricity. It also looks at BREEAM is from the word go, not before it's even built. It's looking at how the materials are sourced for being built, how the materials are being transported. If you're buying lots of steel from China, that's obviously not going to be as good for the environment as buying steel from Sheffield, if you're building it in somewhere like Manchester, let's say. So the future of architecture, I think, is going down that route of it's just trying to become more sustainable, not only in terms of its use, like I said, like electricity, heating. Nowadays you get things like ground source heat pumps. So they have these huge pipes going down into the ground to draw heat from the Earth's, I want to say the Earth's core. That sounds a bit too dramatic. It's not going that deep down, but pulling up heat from the lower ground to heat the building. There's a lot of technology out there that's developing more and more now and becoming more readily available as the prices of it come down, to allow buildings to be built more sustainably and to also sustain themselves for the future as well. I think that's the way things are going to go, as are most things in the world.
Yeah, I think people are becoming more conscious about the environment and wanting to do more for it. So it doesn't surprise me that's bleeding into buildings. You mentioned COVID. I try to avoid it as much as I can in my podcast, but it always seems to crop up. And obviously, space utilization, more people are working at home. Do you think that's going to have an impact on new building, creation, building design, etc.? People aren't going to need big offices anymore, or is there always going to be a place for the office environment and these big, incredible multi-story floored buildings to house these people in?
I think it's fun. Again, I was in a DTM meeting the other day and we had this conversation, and somebody said it, and I think it's true that it was already happening before COVID was a thing. That was happening. COVID has just pushed us quicker to this situation. I mean, I've worked on projects ourselves. We were doing in the Baltic of Liverpool, where rather than designing these big multi-story offices that you used to have, like you look at these old skyscrapers, like the one in Leeds, where it's this huge. Apparently, like a lot of it's empty now. These huge kind of Wall Street, when you watch Wolf of Wall Street, these huge open plan office spaces. The days of that are gone. It's now, we were designing hot desking spaces where people might just rent a space that they come in and out. They take their laptops in. We did a lot of that design, or very small units that, again, they might just still share with other people. They work from home some days. They drop in if they might have a client meeting. They might go in and rent or hire out a meeting room for the day. And then hot desking and being a lot more mobile is far more the future than these big grand offices. And I think it was a move that was already probably been happening, I'd say, as early as kind of like 2012, 2013. It's just COVID has been the final, I think, kind of straw that's pushed it to happen full time, because I'm completely convinced that if COVID were to disappear tomorrow, this way of life of working from home and hot desking when you need to is going to be the future.
Definitely. What do you think is the coolest feature on a building that most people would completely miss, if that makes sense?
The coolest feature on a building? That is a difficult one, actually. The coolest feature on a building. I get quite caught up on invisible structures stuff. So, you might not kind of, like I said, other people might not notice it, but things like cantilevering spaces, you look at things and you think, how is that being held up? An example of which, it's only a small one, but if you know Manchester well, the Beetham Tower in Manchester that's got that step out on it. I think this is only a quick small example. That's a cantilever, and I just look at that and I think it doesn't step out by much. It steps out by a few meters, but then it's got another like 20 stories on top of it, all off that framework. And I just look at things like that, cantilevered spaces, and how they do these structures. You sometimes think, how, I know how they're doing it, obviously, but I think, the time it's taken, the money to do that, when, a lot of people just look at it, it just goes over their head, and you think that's something that's being kind of overlooked and missed by a lot of people. But yeah, I do have an appreciation for when buildings do things they don't necessarily need to do, just to give it that extra kind of cool feature, I suppose.
Yeah, I can never be an architect because I'm terrified of heights. So the thought of going up a building that then overhangs of its own accord and having to work on that, definitely not for me. So I'll definitely stick to a job on terra firma for now. That leads me to my next question, actually. Do you think we'll ever build a space elevator?
I would love to see, like Halo style, or
yeah.
What other film uses space elevator? Ace Combat, that's it, space elevators. I think to a space elevator to get to something like the space station, to then, I don't know if you've seen, there's a film, it's an awful movie actually, but I thought they did it very realistically. There's a film called Ad Astra with
yes, I've seen that. Terrible film.
Terrible movie. Like essentially, myself and my girlfriend watched it, and then it finished, and she just looked at me and we were like, "What was that film?" Like, he just goes and finds his dad, and his dad just doesn't want to see him. But anyway, I think they did a great job of the realism with that, in the way that, I think there's a space elevator, and then they went on another shuttle to the moon, and then the moon had like what looked convincingly like an underground station in New York, but it wasn't. It was definitely the moon. And then they flew from there to Mars. But I think if we're ever going to, and this is something I have great interest in, but I think if we ever are going to have constant and kind of reliable space travel, being able to get past the Earth's surface effectively and without burning millions of tons of natural gases and oils to just punch our way through the atmosphere, something like a space elevator is going to have to be how things are done. So, probably not in our lifetime, but I think it's one of those things. It's got to be the answer, I suppose.
So, speaking of our lifetime, obviously we're only on the planet for a very short period of time in the grand scheme of things. How do you want to leave your mark as an engineer, as an architect? I'm an engineer, as an architect on society. I imagine that's probably one of the great things architects must think about. They want to have that one project that defines them, that has their Widdowson up in lights on top of the side of a building. Have you ever thought about that?
The obvious answer would be to say, I'd like to design a building that people, like you said, people recognize and say, oh, like there's a lot of buildings that I think these days, outside the world of architecture, people recognize buildings, but they might not know, oh, that's a Zaha Hadid building, or that's a Herzog and de Moen building, or, that's a whoever building. But I think doing things, and again, it's only small scale, but doing things that don't just go, oh, that's a famous building that looks really cool, but doing things that actually help people has been nice. I mean, already I drive past and I get great joy out of, and anybody who's in the car with me, I think I've pointed it out, to people hundreds of times, and I think they're bored of it by now, but I'll drive past some of the school extensions I've done in the city, and they're only small school extensions, like an extra dining hall here, but I drive past and I think, and I see, like if the kids are in the playground running around and it's there being used, and I think, I did that, and it's being used, and it's, it's helped that school, and it's helped the community, and it's helped the council, and just little things like that. It is a nice feeling to think, I did something that's improved the lives of however many. I think a school's a great one, because obviously hundreds of children go to school, and it's non-stop in use. So doing school extensions, it's going to be there for 50, 60 years. Thousands of children are going to be using that extension that you've designed. So the scale and grandeur of it isn't always necessarily the most important thing. It's more just the effect and help it can have with the people who are using it, I suppose.
God, you architects are a bunch of sentimental so-and-sos, aren't you? I'm very quickly coming to the end of this episode. Probably one more question. I kind of like to do this with my guests. If you could go back in time, put you in a time machine and go and speak to your younger self before you'd embarked on this whole adventure, what would you say? What advice would you give to yourself, or indeed anyone that's considering becoming an architect? What bit of advice did you wish you'd known before you'd started?
Look into it more, and look into it beyond, because I said this at the start, I was quite naive, and I looked at it into only as far as what would I do at university. I looked into, what will I be studying if I study architecture, which is one aspect of it, but I never looked into the day-to-day of what excuse me, what an architect does. Got hiccups now. And nowadays, I mean, that was in 2009. YouTube was a thing, but it wasn't. We didn't have the vast wealth of knowledge that we have online these days. If you're going to study architecture or you're interested in it, you probably have already done this by this stage. But my advice would be to look into what you really do, because for some people, it won't be for them. That if they are a great designer and things, the reality of being an architect might not be for them. That it's a lot of, like you said, a lot of business management essentially, and a lot of dealing with people. If you're not a people person, you would never be an architect, because again, architecture is dealing with colleagues, but dealing with people outside of the office, planners, clients, people in the meetings. Being an architect, and they do teach you that at uni, like every project you ever do at university, you have to stand up and display it to not only the tutors, but everyone else in the year at the end of each semester. So it's a great, you get a good skill at, talking, public speaking, talking to strangers, talking to a crowd. So if you're not a people person or you don't feel confident doing that, architecture may not be the one for you. But yeah, that's my advice, is just to do a bit of a deep dive into what it really involves.
YouTube is definitely your friend again. One of my favorite architectural type YouTube channels is B1M. It's great, that one. But yeah, honestly, Matt, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. I just thought I'd mention. No, definitely. I thought I'd mention that you don't just do architecture, you do other stuff as well. Obviously, if people want to follow you or find you for architecture stuff, where's the best place they can do that?
For architecture, I don't on socials. I don't really do a lot of, I don't post architecture, but I do a lot of photography stuff on my I have a just Matt Widdowson 14, I think, is where I do a lot of my travel photography, car photography, and that's where the kind of big, when I'm not doing architecture, is motorsport, as you well know.
I was going to say, can people follow you doing driving and on your sim racing, stuff like that?
Yeah, so I've got a small, obviously I have my old YouTube channel, which I've sold now, and I've got a small one called Super 61, which is very small time. I only do it as a bit of a hobby these days, not like my last endeavor, which was, full-time, full-time business. So yeah, Super 61, if you're into anything YouTube and motorsport wise.
Excellent. Honestly, Matt, it's been great to have you on. Obviously, we'll put some little helpful bits in the show notes about where you can find out more about architecture, and obviously your firm you work for. We can obviously share the links on that. Looking forward to see what you have in the pipeline, and obviously as things come out, feel free to share with us, and I'll shout about that as well. But it's been great to have you on for an hour or so, and good luck with the rest of 2021.
Yeah, I appreciate it. You too. Thank you.
I think we can all agree that was a fascinating conversation with Matt about his life as an architect. Massive thanks to him for giving up his time on a busy weekday night. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, why not consider subscribing? And if you're feeling extra nice, maybe even leaving a review. It massively helps us out. If you want to follow us on our socials, it's @JobHunterPodcast on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. And for the professionals out there, we've also got a LinkedIn page. You can also find us on YouTube. It's @JobHunterPodcast. If you fancy dropping us an email, it's jobhunterpodcast@gmail.com. Please get in touch. We don't bite. Finally, I want to say a massive thank you to each and every one of you that listens regularly. We've got a lot of exciting stuff coming up in the next couple of weeks. But until then, I've been Tim French, and you've been listening to the Job Hunter Podcast.